Hello and welcome to my channel. If you're a returning viewer, welcome back. And if you're a first-time viewer, stay where you are, don't go anywhere. I really need the views, okay? So today, what topic will we be delving into? Well, I'm glad you asked. We will be looking at my choice of top 5 vampire books. Okay. Now, before we go any further, before we enter the top 5, I have to commit sacrilege. That's right, sacrilege. You heard me. Because my top 10, my top 5, or my top 10, or my top whatever, my top 5 does not include Dracula. I mean, this is the granddaddy, the godfather of like the modern vampire novel. And, this is the one probably that has inspired, pretty much all of the others that have come after it. But my top 5 doesn't include Dracula, simply because, although I like Dracula, it's not one of my favourite vampire books. Sorry. So, now that we've established that I'm a complete Philistine, what are my top 5? Well, obviously this is subjective and, anyone's top 5 or top 10 can maybe change, given the day. But in at number 5, we have got Enter Night. So Enter Night is by Michael Rowe. It's a relatively new novel. It's basically a haunted house story. If I remember correctly, it's set in the 1970s. So there are no cell phones, no internet, nothing like that. And this kind of helps the story along because it's the sort of classic story of a vampire essentially decimating is the wrong word because decimating means 1 in 10, annihilating a small isolated town. Basically, the story revolves around a young woman and her daughter, and they are having a number of problems, not least of which are financial. And the young woman has a rich mother, and with whom she doesn't have a particularly good relationship. And she goes back to her hometown to stay with her mother simply due to necessity. And while she's there, numerous nefarious goings-on occur, and a vampire is resurrected. A centuries-old vampire is resurrected and begins to cause a number of problems for the town by turning the people into vampires. It's kind of, it's very similar to Salem's Lot in terms of the plot. It's a very different book. It's very differently written, but it's got the same kind of sense. If you've read Salem's Lot, there's a vampire who terrorizing a small town, and mayhem ensues. So that would be my number 5. Number 4, we have F. Paul Wilson's The Keep. Okay, so this is part of a cycle called the Adversary Cycle, and this is the first one in the series. It's the basic story is it's set during the Second World War, and a group of a platoon of German soldiers rocks up to a town in Eastern Europe, and they decide that they're going to bivouac. They're going to, I don't think bivouac's the right word. They're going to sleep in the local keep. If you don't know what a keep is, sorry, patronising. If you don't know what a keep is, it's kind of like the main part of the castle. It's the strongest part of the castle, and there's this keep, obviously, and the Germans announced their decision that they're going to be, camping out in it, much to the displeasure of the locals. So there's obviously some like bad juju going on with the keep, and the Germans occupy said keep, and thanks to a couple of them being a bit treasure hungry, they wake something up, and this something starts killing them. Every night, a German one or two soldiers gets drained of blood. So what basically happens is they find themselves in in this particular situation, and along comes an SS officer, and the SS officer has history with the commander of the Germans in the keep already, And he's a very, very ambitious man, this SS officer, and he's keen to promote his career at any cost. And he's convinced that the murders are the result of partisans, whereas people utilising common sense, such as the commander of the Germans already in the keep, believe it's something else. And they're right, it is something else. So this... I'm being a bit kind of cheeky, calling this a vampire book. It's vampiric in a certain sense. The victims are drained of blood, but it's actually kind of the story takes a bit of a turn away from being being a vampire story. It's not your typical classic vampire story, but I'm being a bit cheeky and considering it a vampire story. It's a very, very, very well written book, and I think it's really, really gripping. It really keeps your attention. So I'd highly recommend it. Next up, we have got, by Grady Hendrix, The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires. So when I first bought this book, when I first got hold of it, from the title, it's quite a jokey kind of light title. And I was expecting a quite kind of jokey, quite kind of light-hearted, funny book. And, it has a certain amount of levity in places, but I was surprised by what, this is a legit, genuine horror. It's got a bit of a kind of, some people might think it's a bit of a flaky title, but it is a legit horror book, and it's got a legitimately evil and horrific protagonist. And, there's a lot going on here. There's a great deal in the way of, relationships between people, between the members of the book club. The members of the book club are all women. And, the interplay between these particular characters, their husbands and so on and so forth is very, very good. The characterization is really great. And the plot is very, very, very involving. And as I said, it's genuinely scary. And the protagonist is no joke. The antagonist is a genuinely formidable monster, basically. Very, very cunning, very devious, and extremely ruthless. So again, it's very, very well written. As with the last book, it really keeps your attention. This was my first Grady Hendrix, and after reading this, I decided I wanted to read everything else by him as well. So again, highly recommended. Next up, we have Let the Right One In by John Ajvide Lindqvist. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. John is such an unusual name. I'm probably getting that completely wrong. But anyway, obviously, this was originally a Swedish. I believe he's a Swedish author. And this is the English translation, which is lucky because I, for one, can't read Swedish. This might well be, until now, the best known book on the list because it was also made into a Swedish film, and it's also been remade by Hollywood. I think the remake stars Chloe Grace Moretz, if I'm not wrong. So this is a superb book, and you can take it on many different levels. The basic story is there's a young boy, and he's a misfit. He's kind of a bit of an oddball, really. And as I say, he's a misfit, and he makes friends with what at first appears to be a little girl, and the little girl turns out to be more than just a little girl and doesn't even, I'm not going to give you any spoilers, but it's very, very kind of, it's a very, very dense book. It contains a lot of different things. There's the horror aspect of it, of a vampire preying on people, but it's more than that. There's the relationship between the boy, Oscar, and the little girl, and who is the vampire. Probably not too much of a spoiler. And it's mainly about their relationship, and it also goes into how, Oscar's home life, Oscar's life at school. The characterization is absolutely superb. When I first read it, I've got to say, I took it as, I took the friendship between Oscar and the vampire as being, I took it as a genuine friendship, whereas some people who've read this book kind of think look at it from the point of view of it's a grooming story, in the sense that the vampire needs a familiar to procure blood for it. And the other, Oscar, is simply the latest in, obviously, the latest in a long line of familiars that have been chosen by the vampire to fulfill this role. So some people see it this way. So if you look at it this way, it's much more sort of a cynical manipulation. And you know what? I actually think that point of view is probably more accurate. I mean, it's easy to forget because the vampire takes the guise of a little girl through no fault of its own, it must be said. It's easy to think of the vampire as being an innocent child. It's easy to forget that this vampire has lived for centuries. You know, obviously it's old, it's been through a lot. And it's easy to sort of, you know, it's easy not to look beyond that, which is something that I didn't do at first. One warning would be, there are certain themes in this book which some people might find offensive, perhaps not offensive, disturbing. It's not an offensive book, but some people might find it disturbing. So the first familiar, when the vampire first appears on the scene, this is not really a spoiler, but just more of a warning. The vampire's familiar is a man called Hakan, who is let's say that he has an unhealthy interest in children, and leave it at that. So if that kind of thing disturbs you, it's something to bear in mind. Although it has to be said, there's nothing especially graphic in the book, I wouldn't say, and I wouldn't let that put you off reading it. Finally, number one on my list, we have Stephen King's Salem's Lot. So Salem's Lot, I believe, would be the oldest among these books. It was Stephen King's second book. I believe he wrote it in 1979, although don't quote me on that. Again, it's similar to like Enter Night. It's about a small town in America, in Maine, and everything's ticking along wonderfully. And then a vampire arrives and starts pissing on everyone's chips, if I can say that. So, for me, this is the granddaddy of this is my absolute favourite vampire story. I'd like to do a video of this. I'm going to do a video just on this book at some point. It takes the classic kind of horror tropes like Dracula. I think it's like Stephen King's take on Dracula. But, you know, you've got the vampire coming to a town, preying on people. Okay, there's nothing new in that. The vampire has a familiar by the name of Straker, who is a very, very chilling character. But I think everything about this novel is superb. The characterization is just great. The plot is great. Basically, the protagonist is a writer called Ben Mears. He grew up in this town, but then moved away, and he had a traumatic experience in a house that stands overlooking the town called the Marston House. So he had this traumatic experience on a dare whilst with some friends when a child. And he's come back to Salem's Lot to hopefully write a book about Salem's Lot and to exorcise some demons, his childhood demons. So unfortunately for him, he arrives more or less at the same time that Straker and his vampire master Barlow arrive, and, you know, things quickly go downhill from there. Apart from the fact that it's Stephen King, it's superbly written, it's superbly plotted. There's never a dull moment. It's never slow. One of the things that King has been accused of, I think, over the years is maybe bloating books out too much. You know, that's a matter of opinion, but definitely in this case, that's not the case. It's genuinely chilling, and I think this is absolutely, for me, the best rendition of vampires in fiction I've ever come across, because the vampires are genuinely terrifying. They're not, you know, there's no resemblance between them and those kind of vampires you might have seen with Bela Lugosi, or even in Twilight, where vampires are kind of interacting with other people and passing off as normal. It's absolutely not the case here. And then again, on the other hand, they're not ravening, savage, zombie-type creatures with no personality. It's like a kind of updated Dracula in a way, kind of Stephen King's take on Dracula. And as I say, I think it's an absolutely superb book. There have been a couple of adaptations. There was an adaptation in I believe, the early 1980s. It's a two-part adaptation starring David Soul, and that two-part adaptation is genuinely terrifying. Then there was, I think, a series in 2004 with Rob Lowe. That kind of, I saw that and I thought that was just, it had nothing to do with Salem's Lot, in my opinion. It was just terrible, in my opinion. Speaking of film adaptations, as I said, Let the Right One In has had, I believe, 2 film adaptations. The Keep has a film adaptation. It's a 1980s movie, I believe, starring Scott Glenn. The film was, I thought, okay, but the book is, if you've seen the film and you like the film, great. If you saw the film and you didn't particularly like it, don't let it put you off the book. The book is far, far, far better. So anyway, those are my top 5 vampire books, novels. If you disagree with me, if you agree with me, please let me know in the comments below. Bit of rap there. And once again, if you've made it to the end of the video, thank you for watching, and hopefully I have horrified you with my choices. See you next time. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.